At Manhattan's exclusive Le Bernardin restaurant, waiter Michael Chen makes a decision that will change his life forever. When an elderly woman realizes she's forgotten her wallet after finishing her meal, Michael quietly pays her $400 bill with his own savings, money he'd been setting aside for his mother's cancer treatment. His manager immediately fires him for breaking protocol, but minutes later, the woman's husband, billionaire investor Robert Sterling, arrives with a shocking revelation. 25 years ago, a young Chinese immigrant saved Sterling's life during a mugging, taking a bullet that was meant for him. The man disappeared before Sterling could repay him. Now, looking at Michael's employee photo, Sterling realizes this waiter is the spitting image of his long-lost savior. The connection between Michael and the mysterious immigrant will unravel a web of secrets that will leave everyone breathless. What happens next isn't just about repaying a debt, it's about a truth so explosive it could shake New York's wealthiest families to their core. Like and subscribe to follow this incredible story of fate, sacrifice, and the shocking ways our past can catch up to us when we least expect it. Michael Chen's day at Le Bernardin had started like any other. At 28, he'd been working at the prestigious restaurant for 3 years, carefully saving every tip and spare dollar for his mother's mounting medical bills. The elegant dining room, with its soft lighting and pristine white tablecloths, was his stage, and he performed his role perfectly, invisible when needed, attentive when called upon. That Thursday evening, he was assigned to table 12, where an elderly woman sat alone, dressed in understated but clearly expensive clothes. She reminded him of his mother, the same gentle eyes, the same graceful way of holding her teacup. "Just tea for now," she said softly. "I'm waiting for my husband." But as the evening progressed, the woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Sterling, became increasingly distressed. Her husband wasn't answering his phone, and she had apparently left her wallet in her other purse. "I'm so embarrassed," she whispered to Michael, her cheeks flushing. "I've never done anything like this before. Could you perhaps hold my pearls as collateral until my husband arrives?" Michael watched as her shaking fingers reached for her necklace. The gesture reminded him painfully of his mother, who had tried to sell her own jewelry to pay for her chemotherapy before Michael stopped her. "Mrs. Sterling," he said quietly, "please don't worry about the bill. I'll take care of it." Before she could protest, he pulled out his own credit card, the one he kept for his mother's medical emergencies, and processed the $400 payment. He knew it would mean missing this month's payment to the hospital, but something in him couldn't bear to see this elderly woman's dignity wounded. Marcus Wright, the restaurant manager, noticed immediately. "Chen!" he barked, calling Michael to the kitchen. "Did you just comp that table?" "No, sir," Michael replied. "I paid for it myself." "You did what?" Wright's face turned red. "That's against every protocol we have. What if she claims the restaurant stole from her? What if she's running a scam? Did you even think about the liability issues?" "Sir, she's clearly a regular customer. She just forgot." "Pack your things," Wright interrupted. "You're fired. We can't have staff making unauthorized decisions about payments. This is Le Bernardin, not some charity kitchen." Michael felt the floor sway beneath him. This job, with its steady salary and generous tips, was his mother's lifeline. Without it... "Please, Mr. Wright," he started to say, but was cut off by commotion from the dining room. Robert Sterling, one of New York's most powerful investment bankers, had arrived. His commanding presence drew every eye in the restaurant as he rushed to his wife's table. After a brief conversation with her, his face darkened. "Where's the waiter who helped my wife?" he demanded. Michael stepped forward, expecting more trouble. Instead, Sterling was staring at him with an expression of shock. "It's impossible," the billionaire whispered. "You look exactly like him." "Like who, sir?" "The man who saved my life 25 years ago." Sterling pulled out his wallet with trembling hands and extracted an old newspaper clipping. The yellowed paper showed a grainy photo of a young Chinese man, a man who could have been Michael's twin. May 15th, 1998, Sterling read aloud. I was being mugged in Chinatown. The attacker had a gun. This man, a recent immigrant who worked at a local restaurant, jumped in front of me when the mugger fired. He took a bullet meant for me, then disappeared in the chaos before ambulances arrived. I've been searching for him ever since. Michael felt a chill run down his spine. May 15th, 1998, was the day his father died, the day his mother never talked about. Sterling was still talking, his voice thick with emotion. The only thing I knew about him was that he worked at Golden Dragon Restaurant and had a pregnant wife. I've had private investigators searching for years, trying to repay my debt, but he seemed to vanish into thin air. Michael's mouth went dry. His mother had worked at Golden Dragon before he was born, and his father, all he knew was that his father had died a hero, but his mother would never explain how. Sir, Michael said carefully, I was born in November 1998. My father died that May, and my mother, she never tells me how it happened. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even Marcus Wright stood frozen, his earlier anger forgotten as he watched this scene unfold. Your mother? Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. What's her name? Lin Chen. She worked at Golden Dragon Restaurant, Sterling finished, his face pale. All these years, and now her son saves my wife's dignity, just like his father saved my life. But before Michael could process this revelation, Sterling's next words changed everything. I think I know why your mother never told you the full story. Because there's something else that happened that day, something that would change both our families forever. Robert Sterling insisted on having this conversation somewhere private. Within minutes, Michael found himself in the restaurant's empty wine cellar with the Sterlings, while upstairs, the regular dinner service continued under Marcus Wright's nervous supervision. Your father's name was Wei Chen, Sterling began, his hands clasped tightly together. He wasn't just a waiter at Golden Dragon. He was a brilliant mathematician who had published groundbreaking papers in China. But when he came to America, his credentials weren't recognized. Margaret Sterling reached out and took Michael's hand. When Robert told me about the man who saved him, I spent years helping him search. We wanted to give his family everything they deserved. But Mom never mentioned any of this, Michael said, his mind reeling. She's worked 3 jobs my whole life. Now she's sick, and I can barely afford her treatments. Why wouldn't she accept help if it was offered? Sterling's face darkened. Because of what happened after your father was shot. You see, I was carrying sensitive documents that day. Proof of massive financial fraud at several major banks. The mugger wasn't really a mugger. He was hired to get those documents, and when he failed, they came after my mother, Michael finished, suddenly understanding. That's why we moved so many times when I was young. Why she was always looking over her shoulder. Yes, Sterling nodded. I tried to find her, to protect her, but she was too good at disappearing. The only thing I could do was make sure those responsible were brought to justice. It took 10 years, but I finally took them down. The evidence your father died protecting helped uncover one of the biggest financial scandals in history. The Harrison Mills collapse of 2008, Michael breathed. Everyone in the financial world knew about that case. Multiple banking executives had gone to prison. What I never told anyone, Sterling continued, was that I had a partner in bringing them down, someone who worked in the shadows, feeding me information for years. Margaret squeezed Michael's hand. Your mother, she said softly. What? Michael stared at them. Lin Chen wasn't just running from danger, Sterling explained. She was gathering evidence, building a case. She had access to restaurants where financial executives dined, hotels where they held secret meetings. She became my secret informant, helping me finish what your father died starting. But then why is she still struggling? Why are we barely surviving? Sterling's face showed deep pain. Because she refused to take any money that might leave a trail. She said her son's safety was worth more than any amount of wealth. So we set up a trust fund in your name instead, waiting for the right time when it would be safe. A trust fund? Michael felt dizzy. Your father saved my life, Sterling said quietly. Your mother helped me bring down criminals who were destroying thousands of lives. That trust fund now contains 25 years of compound interest on a very significant initial investment, plus a percentage of all the recoveries from the Harrison Mills case. How much? Roughly $440 million. Michael had to sit down. The wine racks behind him seemed to spin. There's more, Margaret added gently. Your mother's illness. When was she diagnosed? 3 months ago. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The doctors say... Michael's voice cracked. We know, Sterling said. She finally contacted us last month. Not for herself, but for you. She wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of after she's gone. That's why Margaret was at the restaurant tonight. She was supposed to meet your mother to start arranging everything. But Mom's at chemotherapy today, Michael said. She never mentioned meeting anyone. Because she collapsed this morning and was admitted to the hospital, Margaret said softly. She made us promise not to tell you yet. She didn't want to worry you during your shift. Michael stood up so quickly he knocked over a chair. I have to go to her. Which hospital? Memorial Sloan Kettering, Sterling replied. But Michael, before you go, there's something else you need to know. Something that explains why your mother finally broke her silence after all these years. It's about Marcus Wright, your manager who just fired you. Marcus Wright isn't just a restaurant manager, Sterling explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. His real name is Marcus Harrison Jr. He's the son of one of the executives who went to prison in the Harrison Mills case, and he's been watching your mother for months. Michael felt his blood run cold. What? Your mother discovered he had been hired specifically to keep tabs on you, Margaret added. That's why she finally reached out to us. She knew they were getting close again. Before Michael could process this revelation, his phone buzzed. A text from his mother's doctor. Emergency at hospital. Come quickly. The next hour passed in a blur. Sterling insisted on driving Michael to the hospital in his private car, making several urgent phone calls along the way. By the time they arrived at Memorial Sloan Kettering, private security teams were already in position throughout the building. They found Lin Chen in the ICU, conscious but weak. Her eyes widened when she saw Sterling with her son. I'm sorry, Robert, she whispered. I didn't make it to the meeting. Mom! Michael rushed to her side. Why didn't you tell me? About Dad, about everything? To protect you, she said softly. Always to protect you. But now... She tried to sit up, suddenly urgent. They found us. Marcus ... We know, Sterling assured her. He's being dealt with as we speak. Just then, Michael's phone buzzed again. A news alert. He read it aloud. Breaking. Marcus Harrison Jr., son of convicted financier Marcus Harrison Sr., found dead in apparent suicide at Le Bernardin restaurant. No, Lin Chen's voice was sharp despite her weakness. Not suicide. They're tying up loose ends, just like before. Sterling was already on his phone, barking orders to someone. Lock down all the security footage and get me Detective Zhang from the 1998 case. A nurse entered, checking Lin's vitals. I'm sorry, but she needs rest. You'll have to... They stay, Lin interrupted with surprising force. My son needs to know the truth, all of it, before it's too late. The nurse hesitated, then nodded and left. Lin grasped Michael's hand. Your father, she began. didn't just happen to save Mr. Sterling that day. He knew the attack was coming. He was working with federal agents to expose the corruption. The documents Sterling carried, your father helped compile them. Dad was an undercover informant. Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. We both were, Lynn continued. That's how we met. I was working for the FBI, posing as a waitress. Your father was our mathematical genius, tracking money laundering patterns. We fell in love over spreadsheets and surveillance photos. She smiled faintly at the memory, then grew serious again. When I got pregnant with you, we planned to go into witness protection after the evidence was secured. But someone tipped off Harrison Sr. They sent that shooter, your father. Her voice broke. Sterling picked up the story. Wei Chen's death was made to look random, but it was an assassination. And now, with Harrison Sr. up for parole next month, they're trying to eliminate anyone who might testify against his release. That's why I got sick so suddenly, Lynn said quietly. They've been poisoning me. Small doses in my medications. I realized too late. Michael felt the room spin. No, there has to be something we can do. Some treatment ... There is, a new voice said from the doorway. They all turned to see a distinguished-looking man in a lab coat. I'm Dr. Richard Zhang. Sterling stood quickly. Detective Zhang? You're a doctor now. FBI medical analyst, Zhang corrected. I've been monitoring Mrs. Chen's case since she was admitted. The poison they used is sophisticated but treatable if we act quickly. However, he paused, looking grave. The treatment is experimental and extremely expensive. Money is no object, Sterling said immediately. It's not just about money, Zhang cautioned. The treatment is currently only available at a private facility in Switzerland, and given the active threat against Mrs. Chen's life, moving her would be incredibly risky. Michael looked at his mother, then at Sterling, his mind racing. They had to get her to Switzerland, but how could they transport a critically ill woman across the Atlantic while protecting her from assassins? Sterling's next words showed he was thinking the same thing. What if I told you I have a plan? One that would not only get Lynn to safety, but also finally bring down the entire Harrison organization once and for all? Sterling's plan was audacious. Within hours, a complex operation was set in motion. The media was fed a story that Lynn Chen had died from complications of her cancer. A funeral was arranged, complete with a closed casket and mourning relatives, all FBI agents in disguise. Meanwhile, the real Lynn was secretly transferred to a private medical facility hidden within Sterling's Manhattan penthouse. Dr. Zhang supervised her care while preparations were made for the journey to Switzerland. The Harrison organization will be watching the funeral, Sterling explained to Michael. They'll want to be certain Lynn is really dead. That's when we set our trap. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Anonymous tips would lead Harrison Sr.'s lawyers to evidence suggesting that Lynn had left behind a damaging confession hidden in a safe deposit box. The organization would have to try to retrieve it before it could be found by authorities. But there is no confession, is there? Michael asked, understanding dawning. No, Sterling smiled grimly, but the bank's security cameras will record everyone who attempts to access that box. We'll finally identify all the players in their organization. The day of the fake funeral arrived. Michael played his part perfectly, the grieving son watched by hidden FBI cameras. As predicted, several suspicious figures were observed surveilling the ceremony. But the real action was taking place across town. Sterling's security team had detected multiple attempts to hack into the bank's security system. Someone was desperate to find that safe deposit box. They took the bait, Zhang confirmed, watching the surveillance feeds in Sterling's penthouse. Now we wait. Lynn, resting in the medical suite, reached for Michael's hand. I'm sorry for all the lies, son. After your father died, all I could think about was keeping you safe. I understand now, Mom, Michael said softly. But no more secrets, okay? Their conversation was interrupted by sudden activity on the security monitors. Several well-dressed men had entered the bank, presenting paperwork that appeared to authorize access to multiple safe deposit boxes. "Got you," Sterling muttered, watching the feeds. "That's Harrison Sierra's personal lawyer. And that man with him, he's a federal judge who's been suspected of taking bribes for years." The operation was unfolding perfectly until a bank employee, one who hadn't been briefed on the sting, innocently mentioned that Robert Sterling had visited the bank earlier that week. The men immediately withdrew, their suspicions clearly aroused. Within minutes, alarms were blaring throughout Sterling's building. "They've found us," Zhang announced tensely. Multiple armed individuals approaching through the service entrance. Sterling's security team sprang into action, but they were dealing with professional killers. The sound of gunfire erupted from the lower floors. "The helipad," Sterling ordered. "Now!" They had prepared for this contingency. A medical helicopter was already waiting on the roof, its engines idling. But as they rushed Lynn's gurney toward the elevator, Michael noticed something on the security feeds that made his blood run cold. Marcus Wright, very much alive and definitely not dead by suicide, was leading the assault team. He was working with them the whole time, Michael realized. The suicide report was fake, a way to get inside information about our plans. They reached the roof just as the first explosions rocked the building. The assault team was using shaped charges to breach the security doors. "Get her on the helicopter!" Sterling shouted over the noise. "I'll hold them off." "No!" Michael pushed Sterling toward the aircraft. "Mom needs you to get her to Switzerland. I'll stay." "Michael, please," Lynn begged from her gurney. "Don't do this." "Dad gave his life to protect the truth," Michael said firmly. "I finally understand why." He turned to Sterling. "Get her to safety. Get her the treatment. Promise me." Before anyone could argue further, the roof access door burst open. Michael slammed the helicopter's door shut and turned to face the emerging figures, armed only with his courage and the knowledge that his mother's survival depended on these next few moments. What happened next would be talked about in FBI circles for years to come. What no one knew, not Sterling, not even Lynn, was that Michael had been preparing for this moment ever since he first suspected something was wrong at Le Bernardin. His seemingly humble job as a waiter had allowed him to observe the city's most powerful people, including many of Harrison's associates, in unguarded moments. As Marcus Wright and his team emerged onto the roof, Michael stood between them and the departing helicopter, his hands raised. "You're too late," he said calmly, "but I'm guessing you're not really here for my mother anyway." Wright smiled coldly. "Smart boy. Where's the real evidence?" "The same place it's been for 25 years, Michael replied. "In plain sight." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a fortune cookie, the last thing his father had given him before he died, preserved all these years in a plastic case. Inside wasn't a fortune, but a microchip containing the original banking algorithms his father had developed to track Harrison's money laundering. "Dad knew they'd search everywhere else," Michael explained. "But who would think to check a child's keepsake?" Wright's smile faltered. At that moment, dozens of laser sights appeared on his team as FBI snipers revealed their positions on surrounding buildings. The entire operation had been coordinated by Michael and Zhang over the past week, using the fake funeral as cover to position their forces. "Did you really think Sterling would leave his penthouse unprotected?" Michael asked. "Or that my mother's medical team was just medical staff?" The disguised FBI tactical team emerged from their hidden positions around the helipad. Wright and his men were surrounded. "Your father was annoyingly clever too," Wright snarled, dropping his weapon, "right up until I shot him." "I know," Michael said quietly. "That's why I made sure you'd be here tonight. 25 years is a long time to wait for justice." 1 year later, Michael stood in a sunlit room in Switzerland, watching his mother walk unassisted for the first time in months. The experimental treatment had been successful, and Lin Chen was finally cancer-free. The Harrison organization had been completely dismantled. The evidence from Wei Chen's microchip, combined with the attempted assassination at Sterling's penthouse, had provided everything needed for dozens of prosecutions. Marcus Wright had traded information for a lighter sentence, exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of finance and government. Robert Sterling had made good on his promise to honor Wei Chen's sacrifice. The trust fund was used to establish the Chen Sterling Foundation, dedicated to helping immigrant families and exposing corporate corruption. Michael now ran its daily operations, working alongside Sterling to continue his parents' legacy of fighting for justice. Lin had finally found peace, no longer looking over her shoulder. She split her time between teaching mathematics at a local university and helping Margaret Sterling run charitable programs for underserved communities. On the anniversary of that fateful night at Le Bernardin, the families gathered for dinner at Sterling's Lake Geneva villa. As they shared stories and laughter, Michael realized that his father's last gift, that simple fortune cookie, had protected not just evidence, but hope itself. Hope that truth would eventually prevail, that justice would be served, and that courage would be rewarded. "Your father would be proud," Lin told Michael as they watched the sunset over the lake. "Not just of what you did that night, but of who you've become." "We all did it together," Michael replied, thinking of how a simple act of kindness, paying a stranger's restaurant bill, had set in motion events that would right a quarter-century of wrongs. Sterling raised his glass in a toast to Wei Chen, who saved more than just my life that day. He saved our faith in justice, in courage, and in the power of truth to prevail. The fortune cookie now sits in a display case at the Chen Sterling Foundation's headquarters, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from grand gestures, but from simple moments of human kindness, and that even the longest buried truths will eventually find their way into the light.